The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the sprawling suburban park just beyond the hum of Atlanta's bustling streets. The air was crisp and invigorating, laced with the earthy aroma of freshly trimmed grass and the subtle dampness of dew clinging to the soil. For Special Agent Ryan Carter, this was sacred timing escape from the relentless churn of her life at the FBI. Every dawn, she traded the suffocating weight of case files and covert operations for the rhythmic thud of her sneakers against the winding trails. This park, with its towering oaks stretching skyward and azaleas bursting in vibrant clusters, was her sanctuary. The glassy lake at its center reflected the soft hues of sunrise, a mirror to her need for stillness before the storm of her day began. Ryan, in her mid-30s, carried herself with a quiet power and athletic, her frame sculpted by years of discipline, her sharp eyes glinting with a vigilance that never fully softened. Even here, she had chosen this retreat deliberately, a pocket of peace far enough from her downtown apartment to feel like a world apart. Growing up in Birmingham, Alabama, in a modest home framed by the echoes of civil rights marches, Ryan had learned early that justice wasn't a gift, it was a battle. Her parents, tireless advocates who'd faced down fire hoses and snarling dogs, had planted in her a fierce moral compass, one that guided her through college, the punishing trials of Quantico, and into the elite corridors of the Bureau. Her career was her armor, forged through sleepless nights and unrelenting resolve, but it came at a cost. Relationships withered under the strain of her hours, and though she cherished her family's unwavering support, there were moments when the solitude pressed against her chest like a heavy stone. In a field dominated by white men, Rihanna, a black woman with a gaze that could cut through steel, didn't beg for a seat at the table. She claimed it, her reputation as a dogged, principled investigator trailing her like a shadow. That morning, as she stretched beside her car, her movements precise and practiced, Ryan barely registered the familiar faces dotting the trail. An elderly couple coaxing their golden retriever along, a young mother maneuvering a stroller with a sleepy toddler, a middle-aged man grunting through lunges near the picnic tables. She nodded faintly at them, a reflex more than a greeting, before slipping her earbuds in and tightening her laces. Routine was her anchor, and she sank into it, her breath steadying as she started her jog. The park unfolded around her, leaves rustling faintly in the breeze, birds chattering overhead. The world still waking up. She had run this path countless times, its curves and dips as familiar as her own heartbeat. It was public land, open to all, a fact that made what happened next feel like a jagged tear in the fabric of her reality. "Hey you." "Yeah, I'm talking to you." The voice sliced through the calm, rough and commanding, shattering the morning's serenity. Ryan's pulse quickened, not from exertion, but from the sudden jolt of unease. She turned her head slightly, catching sight of a tall, burly police officer striding toward her from across the path. His uniform was pristine, starched to perfection, but his sunglasses sat low on his nose, framing a scowl that oozed contempt. His boots thudded against the ground, each step a declaration of authority. And as he closed the distance, Ryan felt the air thicken, the peace she'd sought slipping through her fingers like sand. Her mind raced, sifting through possibilities. She'd been here before, same park, same routine without incident. What could he want? What are you doing here?" he barked, his voice dripping with accusation. Ryan's chest tightened, a flicker of disbelief sparking beneath her calm exterior. She paused, her sneakers scuffing the gravel, and considered her options. Ignore him, engage. The weight of eyes began to settle on her passers-by, slowing their steps, their curiosity prickling the edges of her awareness. "You deaf, or just ignoring me?" he snapped again, louder now, his broad frame looming closer. The tension coiled tighter, a spring ready to snap. "I'm just running," she said, her voice steady but threaded with a quiet incredulity. She met his gaze, unflinching, though her stomach churned with a mix of anger and confusion. "Is there a problem?" The officer's lips curled into a harsh, humorless laugh that grated against the stillness. "A problem? Yeah, there's a problem. You don't belong here." The words landed like a punch, each one laced with a venom that Ryan knew all too well, a venom rooted in something deeper, uglier than mere suspicion. Her breath caught, not from fear but from the sting of recognition. She'd faced this before. The unspoken assumptions, the sit-along glances, the way her presence alone could unsettle certain people. "Excuse me," she replied, her tone hardening but still measured, her hands resting calmly at her sides. Inside, though, a storm brewed, indignation warring with the discipline she'd honed over years. The onlooker's stares bore into her now, a silent jury too timid to intervene. "You heard me," he spat, stepping closer, his bulk invading her space until she could smell the faint tang of coffee on his breath. "We've had reports of suspicious activity in this park. You match the description. Suspicious activity." The phrase hung there heavy and loaded, and Ryan's skin prickled under the weight of his scrutiny. She knew what he meant, what he saw when he looked at her. Not a runner, not a person, a threat. "You mean jogging?" she shot back, her voice sharpening, a blade slipping free of its sheath. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath the surface, and his eyes narrowed behind those tinted lenses. "Don't get smart with me, ID." Now, the demand was a growl, a flex of power that made her blood simmer. She reached for her phone instead, her fingers steady despite the heat rising in her chest. "I'll record this, thanks," she said, her tone clipped but resolute. That was the tipping point. His hand shot forward, swift and reckless, knocking the device from her grasp. It hit the ground with a sickening crack, the sound slicing through the murmurs of the small crowd that had gathered wide-eyed, frozen, clutching their dogs and strollers. "You think you can talk to me like that? You're nobody," his voice roared, echoing across the park as he raised his leg, his boot hovering ominously aimed at her phone. Or perhaps at her. Time seemed to fracture, each second stretching into eternity. Ryan's heart pounded, but her mind was a steel trap, calculating, waiting. Then, as his foot descended, she moved fast, fluid, precise. Her hands darted out, seizing his ankle midair with a grip honed by years of training. With a sharp twist, she yanked him off balance, sending him stumbling backward, his arms flailing as he fought to stay upright. Gasps erupted from the crowd, a collective intake of breath that rippled through the morning air. The officer's face flushed a deep, furious crimson as he scrambled to his feet, dirt clinging to his once immaculate uniform. "You're under arrest," he bellowed, fumbling for his cuffs, his pride wounded and bleeding out in front of everyone. But Ryan didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture unyielding, and with a calm that bordered on icy. She reached into her jacket, her fingers closed around the familiar weight of her badge, pulling it free with the ease of muscle memory. "No," she said, her voice a low, controlled thunder that cut through his bluster. She held the emblem up, its gleam catching the sunlight, and his eyes locked onto it, widening in slow, dawning horror. What is this?" he stammered, his bravado crumbling. "I'm an FBI agent," she said, each word a hammer striking stone, shattering the illusion he'd built. "And you've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Silence crashed over the park, broken only by the faint whisper of leaves stirring in the breeze. The man who'd strutted toward her, puffed up with arrogance, now stood deflated, his mouth gaping like a fish pulled from water. The crowd shifted, their murmurs rising again. But Ryan's focus remained locked on him, and the sweat beating at his temple, the tremor in his hands, the realization sinking into his bones. This wasn't the end, though. It was the beginning of something far bigger. The humiliation he'd tried to heap on her was a fleeting shadow compared to the reckoning she'd unleash. Ryan wasn't just any agent. She was a Forcia woman armed with evidence, tenacity, and a burning resolve to uproot the corruption that festered in places like this. That officer, with his crisp uniform and unchecked power, had no idea what he'd stumbled into, what drove him to wield his authority like a club, to target her with such reckless disdain. And how would the system he'd leaned on abuse it wreaked when she turned its own machinery against it? The elderly couple by the trail clutched each other's arms, their golden retriever whining softly as they whispered about the scene. The young mother's hands tightened on her stroller, her toddler stirring awake. Oblivious to the drama, the man doing lunges had stopped mid-motion, his jaw slack as he watched the tables turn. They weren't just witness, they were threads in a tapestry Ryan would weave into something undeniable. She'd seen the rot before, in quiet parks, in precincts, in the sit-along glances of those who thought they could bend the world to their will. But she'd also seen just as hard won, unyielding, a beacon forged in the fire of resilience. As the officer's bravado dissolved into stunned silence, Ryan's mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just about one man's arrogance. It was about the consequences of power run amok, the fragility of a system that shielded the wrong people, and the strength it took to demand accountability. She'd file the report, gather the footage from nearby cameras, call in favors from colleagues who'd seen her fight these battles before. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers trailing behind them, but Ryan lingered, her gaze sweeping the park she'd once called a refuge. The lesson here wasn't just hers, it was theirs, too. Justice wasn't a quiet jog in the morning light. It was a storm, and she was its eye, steady and unrelenting, ready to show them all what happened when you crossed the wrong line. After months of relentless work in New York, tying up loose ends on a grueling assignment that had drained her both mentally and physically, she transferred to an FBI field office in Atlanta. The move wasn't just a change of scenery, it was a lifeline, a chance to catch her breath, to recalibrate her spirit after the suffocating intensity of her last case. She'd hoped the sprawling city, with its vibrant tapestry of black culture and deep historical roots, might offer her some solace, a place to rediscover a sense of balance. But even here, amid the humid air and the echoes of resilience, the ugly shadow of racism didn't bother knocking before barging in. It lingered like an uninvited guest, always ready to make its presence known. One such reminder came in the form of Officer David Harding, a man whose very existence seemed to embody the tension between power and prejudice. Nearing 50, Harding carried the weight of his years in his stocky frame, his broad shoulders perpetually squared as if bracing for a fight. His face, etched with a scowl that rarely softened, told a story of bitterness, while his ego swelled larger than the jurisdiction he patrolled. For him, the badge pinned to his chest wasn't merely a marker of authority, it was a fortress, a justification for the biases he'd nurtured since childhood. Raised in a small, mostly white Georgia town where the world was neatly divided into us and them, Harding had grown up swallowing tales of superiority whole. The police force hadn't been a choice so much as a destiny, a natural extension of the man he'd been molded to become. Over the decades, he'd risen through the ranks, his climb unimpeded by a system that turned a blind eye to men like him, who wore their authority like armor and wielded it like a weapon. Yet, even Harding couldn't entirely escape the consequences of his actions. Whispers of complaints had begun to trail him, accusations of racial profiling, heavy-handed tactics, and sharp-tongued remarks that cut deeper than he'd ever admit. The department's brass had issued warnings, but they were flimsy, half-hearted slaps on the wrist that did little to curb his behavior. Harding was a master at dancing along the edge of accountability, pushing just far enough to assert his dominance without tipping over into territory that might actually cost him. Deep down, he bristled at the oversight, interpreting every raised eyebrow as a personal affront to the power he'd spent his life building. Justice to him was a one-way street, and he was the one holding the map. That morning, Harding sat in his cruiser near the park, a chipped mug of coffee steaming in his grip as he stewed in his own irritation. His personal life was a wreck, divorce papers still fresh with ink, his teenage son drifting further into a sullen stranger with each passing day. The bitterness of it all gnawed at him, fueling the restless discontent that simmered beneath his surface. He didn't like this part of town, didn't trust the people who milled about the park with their easy laughter and carefree strides. To him, they were outsiders in his world, and he watched them with the suspicion of a man who saw threats in every shadow. When his radio crackled to life with a report of a suspicious individual, a black woman, mid-30s, athletic build, his ears perked up, a predator catching the scent of prey. The description was vague, but that didn't matter. Harding didn't need details to act. He never had. He'd find someone who fit the bill, always did. Across the park, Ryan Carter laced up her running shoes, her breath steadying as she prepared to lose herself in the rhythm of her jog. The trail stretched out before her, winding past the glassy surface of the lake, where the morning sun cast golden ripples. With each step, the thud of her sneakers against the packed earth synced with the pulse of music in her earbuds, a temporary shield against the weight she carried. She'd come here to shed the tension that clung to her shoulders like a second skin, to let the breeze and the motion unravel the knots of her last case. She didn't notice the cruiser parked just beyond the tree line, its dark shape blending into the scenery, nor the way Harding's eyes narrowed as they latched onto her. She was just another jogger, lost in her own world until she wasn't. Harding swung open the door of his cruiser and stepped out, his heavy boots grinding into the gravel path with deliberate force. He adjusted his belt, the clink of metal a subtle assertion of his presence, and fixed his gaze on Ryan as she passed. His stride was slow but purposeful, his hand resting casually on his radio as if it were an extension of himself. Ryan sensed him before she saw him, a prickling shift in the air, the kind that made her gut tighten and her instincts flare. She slowed her pace, tugging one earbud free as she turned to face the figure approaching her. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice clipped and dripping with command. "Hold up a second." Ryan's brow furrowed, her chest still heaving from the exertion of her run. "Can I help you?" "Officer," she asked, her tone steady but laced with a cautious edge. She stood tall, her athletic frame radiating quiet strength, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of wariness. Harding sized her up, his lips twisting into a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around here," he said, his words heavy with implication. "Mind telling me what you're doing?" Confusion rippled across her face as she gestured to her sweat-dampened clothes. "I'm running," she replied, her voice firm yet tinged with disbelief. "Like everyone else here. Is that right?" Harding took a step closer, his boots scuffing the ground as he invaded her space. "You got ID on you?" Ryan blinked, caught off guard by the absurdity of the request. "ID for jogging in a public park." Her tone remained even, but a spark of indignation flickered beneath it. Harding's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of irritation. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, his voice sharpening like a blade. "Just show me your ID, and we won't have a problem." The exchange wasn't lost on the handful of bystanders nearby. Their eyes darted between the two, curiosity mingling with unease as the tension thickened. Ryan felt the weight of their stares pressing against her, but she held her ground, her composure unshaken. "Officer, I'm not required to carry ID while running," she said, her words deliberate and clear. "Is there a reason you're singling me out?" Harding's face hardened, his jaw clenching as if her question were a personal insult. He didn't like being challenged at a spele, not by someone like her, someone who didn't fit the script he'd written in his head. "Look," he said, his voice dropping into a low, menacing growl, "you can cooperate, or I can make this a lot harder for you." Her jaw tightened, a storm of emotion swirling beneath her calm exterior. She'd been here before too many times to count cornered by the same tired power play. The humiliation stung, a sharp ache that burrowed into her chest, but it was the injustice of it that burned hottest. She knew the rules of this game, knew how quickly it could spiral if she pushed back too hard. Yet the fire of defiance smoldered within her, fueled by every encounter like this one she'd endured. This wasn't just about her, thought not anymore. Ryan wasn't merely a jogger caught in a petty standoff. She was an FBI agent, a woman who'd spent years peeling back the layers of systemic rot, exposing the very abuses of power that Harding embodied. And now, here he stood, oblivious to the irony, dangling his authority over her like a noose. Around them, the park's morning rhythm faltered. An elderly couple walking their golden retriever paused, their weathered faces creasing with concern as they exchanged hushed words. The dog whimpered softly, sensing the shift, and they turned away, retreating down the trail with reluctant steps. A young mother pushing a stroller quickened her pace, her eyes darting over her shoulder as she clutched the handle tighter, her toddler oblivious to the unease rippling through the air. The park, once a haven of quiet motion, now buzzed with the electricity of an impending clash, the kind that could crack open the sky. "Are we going to have a problem here, or are you going to cooperate?" Harding pressed, his impatience sharpening his tone. He stood with his hands on his hips, his broad frame casting a shadow over her. Ryan drew a slow breath, her gaze locking onto his with an intensity that made him falter just for a heartbeat. "Officer, I've told you I'm here for a jog, same as everyone else," she said, her voice a measured thread of steel. "I haven't done anything to deserve this." Harding's smirk returned, thicker now. dripping with condescension. "Listen, lady, I don't care what you think you're doing. I asked for ID. If you don't have it, that's your problem. Now you can follow my instructions, or I'll take this to the next level. Your choice." "Take it to the next level," Ryan echoed, her calm unwavering, but her eyes flashing with quiet fire. "Are you threatening me?" Harding's posture stiffened, his fingers twitching near his radio. "Don't twist my words," he shot back, his voice rising. "I'm giving you a chance to make this easy. Don't push me." Before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. A young man in a hoodie, jogging nearby, slowed to a stop. "Hey, is everything okay here?" he asked, his tone tentative but threaded with genuine concern. He glanced at Ryan, then at Harding, his hands fidgeting as he weighed whether to step closer. Harding wheeled on him, his patience snapping like a brittle twig. "This doesn't concern you. Keep moving." The man hesitated, his eyes flickering back to Ryan, a flicker of solidarity in his expression. "It just looks like she's not doing anything wrong." "Maybe you should," I said. "Keep moving," Harding barked, taking a menacing step toward him. The young man flinched, his resolve crumbling under the officer's glare, and he jogged off, casting one last apologetic glance over his shoulder. Ryan's fists clenched at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought the urge to lash out. The humiliation was a bitter pill, but the unfairness, sheer, blatant abuse of power set her blood boiling. She couldn't let this spiral, not here, not now, but the weight of it pressed against her ribs, demanding release. "You're scaring people," she said, her voice low but cutting. "Do you even realize what you're doing?" Harding leaned in, his sneer twisting into something uglier. "I'm doing my job," he hissed, his breath hot with coffee and contempt. In that moment, the air between them crackled with unspoken stakes. For Harding, this was about control, about bending the world to his will. For Ryan, it was a microcosm of the fight she'd waged her entire career, a fight against the arrogance of unchecked power, against the systems that propped up men like him. Justice wasn't just a concept to her, it was a lifeline, a promise she'd made to herself and to every person crushed under the weight of prejudice. And as Harding loomed over her, oblivious to the depth of the woman he'd targeted, the lesson hung heavy in the air. Power without accountability was a house of cards, and consequences, when they came, could topple it all. The morning sun filtered through the sprawling branches of the park's ancient oaks, casting dappled shadows on the gravel path where Officer David Harding stood, his chest puffed out with self-assured bravado. "What I'm doing," he sneered, his voice thick with mockery as it rolled off his tongue, "is my job, something you wouldn't even begin to understand." His words hung in the air like a taunt, dripping with condescension, as though he were daring the woman before him to challenge his unshakable authority. Across from him, Ryan Carter's dark eyes narrowed ever so slightly, her steady gaze piercing through the haze of his arrogance. Beneath her composed exterior, a storm brewed, anger, frustration, and a bone-deep weariness she'd carried for years. She clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms just enough to keep her grounded, though a flicker of her true emotions slipped through the cracks of her calm facade. "I understand a lot more than you think," she replied, her voice low and measured, each syllable laced with a quiet intensity that made the air between them crackle. The tension was palpable, electric, as if the unspoken truths Ryan held close to her chest were live wires, sparking in the space between them. She wasn't ready to lay all her cards on the table, not yet. David, oblivious to the depth of the woman he faced, smirked with the smug satisfaction of someone who believed he held all the power. For now, Ryan let him stew in his ignorance, though her patience was a fraying thread, stretched thin by every word that tumbled from his mouth. She could feel the weight of his misjudgment pressing against her, and she wondered how long she could hold back before his next move forced her hand. "Turn around," David barked suddenly, his hand darting to the radio clip to his shoulder, fingers fumbling with the device as he pulled it free. "I'm detaining you for further questioning." His tone was sharp, authoritative, but there was a tremor beneath it, a crack in his armor he didn't even realize was there. Ryan's brow arched, and she echoed his words back to him, her voice rising with a mix of disbelief and defiance. "Detaining me?" A dry, incredulous laugh escaped her lips, sharp and cutting, as she shook her head. For what? Running. The absurdity of it gnawed at her, stirring the embers of outrage she'd fought so hard to keep buried. She'd seen this play out too many times, power wielded like a blunt instrument, swung without thought or reason. David's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he doubled down. "You're being uncooperative," he snapped, his voice growing louder, more insistent, as if volume alone could cement his control. "That's reason enough." But Ryan wasn't buying it. Her tone sharpened, slicing through his bluster like a blade through paper. "No, it's not," she shot back, stepping closer, her sneakers crunching softly against the gravel. "And you know it. You're making this up as you go because you think you can get away with it." Her words landed like a slap, and for a fleeting moment, David's mask slipped. Beneath the bravado, she caught a glimpse of something raw: frustration, maybe even a flicker of doubt, but his pride was a fortress, and he refused to let it crumble. "I don't have to explain myself to you," he growled, his voice rough with defiance. "Turn around and put your hands where I can see them." Ryan's breath quickened, her chest rising and falling as her mind raced. She could feel the eyes of the gathering crowd boring into her, their silent stares heavy with judgment and hesitation. They stood on the sidelines, witnesses to a scene they'd likely seen play out before, yet none dared to intervene. This was the kind of moment she'd dedicated her career to dismantling: blatant abuse of power, steeped in bias and intimidation, the kind that left scars on entire communities. But here, in this sunlit park, she wasn't Special Agent Ryan Carter of the FBI. She was just another black woman caught in the crosshairs, her authority stripped away by the uniform standing before her. The irony wasn't lost on her, and it fueled the fire simmering in her veins. "You really want to do this?" she asked, her voice cutting through the thick tension like a honed edge. Her eyes locked onto his, unyielding, daring him to push further. "Because I promise you, you're making a mistake you won't recover from," David scoffed, his confidence surging back like a wave crashing against the shore. "Oh, really?" he taunted, stepping closer, his boots scuffing the gravel. "And what are you going to do about it?" His challenge hung in the air, bold and reckless, oblivious to the storm he was stoking. Ryan's hand twitched toward the pocket of her running jacket, her fingers brushing the fabric before she stopped herself. Not yet, she thought, her pulse hammering in her ears. She needed to let this unfold just a little longer, to let David dig his own grave with every arrogant word and gesture. Round them, the onlookers stirred, emboldened by the escalating exchange. A woman in a faded blue hoodie pulled out her smartphone, her hands trembling as she angled it toward the scene. "Are you filming this?" she whispered to her partner, a lanky man with wide, nervous eyes who nodded faintly. David's head snapped toward them, his expression darkening. "Hey, no filming," he shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "This is official business." But it was too late. The woman's grip on her phone tightened, her face a mix of fear and defiance as she murmured, "This isn't right." Her voice was soft, quivering, but it carried a resolve that rippled through the crowd. David's hand twitched toward his belt, hovering near his holster as frustration coiled in his muscles. Before he could act, Ryan took a deliberate step forward, her presence a quiet force that demanded attention. "That's enough," she said, her voice ringing with an authority that cut through the chaos. For a split second, David faltered, thrown off by the steel in her tone. But his arrogance flared back to life, a desperate attempt to reclaim control. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he spat, his eyes narrowing as he squared his shoulders. Ryan's lips pressed into a thin line, her restraint teetering on the edge of collapse. Every fiber of her being screamed to end this charade, to drop the mask and reveal the truth with a single, undeniable act. But she held back, her mind calculating, waiting for the perfect moment. David's radio crackled to life, shattering the tense silence with a burst of static. "Harding, status update," a gruff voice demanded from the other end. He ignored it, his focus locked on Ryan, his pride refusing to let him yield. "Turn around," he repeated, his voice hard and unyielding. "This is your last warning." Ryan tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable, a calm before the storm. "No," she said simply, the word a quiet thunderclap that reverberated through the air. It was defiant, unapologetic, and it hung there, daring him to respond. The crowd, now swelling with curious onlookers, watched with bated breath, their collective anticipation thickening the atmosphere. Something monumental was brewing, a collision of wills that no one could tear their eyes from. David's face twisted with frustration, his grip on the situation slipping through his fingers like sand. His knuckles whitened as he clenched the handle of his belt, his jaw set in a stubborn line. Across from him, Ryan stood tall, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to the fury simmering beneath her skin. She could feel the weight of every gaze, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. The park, once a haven of serenity with its rustling leaves and distant birdsong, now felt like the stage for an impending reckoning. "Turn around," David barked again, his voice trembling with a mix of rage and unease. "I won't say it again." Ryan's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile, her eyes glinting with a quiet triumph. "You've been saying that for 5 minutes, officer," she replied evenly, her tone laced with a subtle mockery that hit him like a punch. "You're not in control here, and you're starting to realize it." Her words struck deep, and David's face flushed a deep crimson, his breath hitching as he struggled to maintain his composure. He stepped closer, the gravel crunching loudly beneath his boots, his voice rising to a desperate shout. "I said turn around." The crowd flinched at the outburst, but Ryan didn't budge. "Think very, very carefully about your next move," she warned, her tone sharpening, slicing through his bravado with surgical precision. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced the murmurs around them, drawing every eye to the standoff. Even the woman with the phone lowered it slightly, caught in the gravity of Ryan's presence. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" David snapped, his voice cracking as he reached for the cuffs on his belt, his hand trembling with a mix of fury and uncertainty. Ryan's eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, there was no mask, no restraint, just an unflinching resolve that seemed to pin him in place. "It means you're making the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice steady and deliberate. Then, with a slow, calculated grace, she reached into her jacket pocket. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath as her hand emerged, holding not a weapon, but her phone. David's hand shot to his holster, his voice breaking with panic. "Don't you dare." Ryan froze, her hands raised to show she was unarmed, her expression calm but commanding. "Relax, Officer Harding," she said, her tone almost gentle, though it carried an unmistakable edge. "I'm just reaching for my badge." David blinked, his mind scrambling to catch up. "Your badge?" he stammered, confusion breaking through the wall of his anger. With a deliberate motion, Ryan pulled out her FBI badge, holding it aloft for all to see. The polished gold caught the sunlight, the letters FBI gleaming with undeniable authority. The crowd erupted into a chorus of whispers and gasps, their murmurs swelling into a wave of astonishment. David's face drained of color, his eyes darting from the badge to Ryan's unflinching gaze, then to the crowd now watching with rapt attention. What is this?" he faltered, his bravado crumbling like dry earth beneath his feet. Ryan stepped closer, her voice cutting through the chaos with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "This," she said, "is the authority you're trying to abuse. I'm Special Agent Ryan Carter with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over him like a shroud. "And you, Officer Harding, have just made the biggest mistake of your career." David stumbled back, his mind reeling as he stared at the badge, hoping against hope that it was some kind of trick. "FBI," he muttered, his voice barely audible, a hollow echo of the confidence he'd wielded moments before. The crowd pressed closer, their murmurs growing louder, their phones now raised high to capture the unraveling scene. The woman in the hoodie, her hands still shaking, exchanged a wide-eyed glance with her partner, who whispered, "I told you something was off." Her resolve hardened, and she kept filming, her quiet defiance a testament to the shift in the air. Ryan stood unwavering, her badge a beacon of justice in the midst of the storm. She'd spent years fighting against the kind of overreach David represented, the kind that thrived on unchecked power and left lives in its wake. Now, as she watched him falter, she felt a surge of vindication tempered by sorrow for him, for the system that had emboldened him, for the countless others who'd faced this same abuse without her resources to fight back. David's radio crackled again, the voice on the other end growing insistent. But he couldn't tear his eyes from Ryan. His hands fell limp at his sides, the cuffs dangling uselessly from his fingers. The lesson here was stark and unforgiving. Power, when wielded without accountability, was a house of cards waiting to collapse. David had mistaken his uniform for invincibility, but in his arrogance, he'd crossed a line that would haunt him long after this moment faded. For Ryan, it was a bittersweet Victoria reminder of the work still ahead, the battles yet to be fought. As the crowd's whispers grew into a roar, she lowered her badge, her gaze never leaving David's. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back, not for him, not for her, and not for the witnesses who'd seen justice rise from the ashes of his hubris. The air was thick with tension, a palpable weight pressing down on everyone gathered in the dimly lit street. David Harding's voice trembled, barely rising above a hushed murmur as he repeated himself, the words slipping out like a confession he hadn't meant to make. "That's right," he muttered, his throat tightening as though the admission choked him. Across from him, Ryan Carter stood like a pillar of unshakable resolve, her voice ringing out steady and authoritative, cutting through the haze of his faltering bravado. "And I've spent my entire career watching officers just like you," she declared, her tone carrying the weight of years spent observing, waiting, and preparing for this very moment. Men who believe that shiny badge pinned to their chest grants them a free pass, a license to intimidate, to discriminate, to strut around like they're above the law. Untouchable in their arrogance, she took a deliberate step forward, her boots clicking against the cracked pavement, forcing David to lift his gaze and meet the fire in her eyes. "But here's the truth, Officer Harding," she continued, her words sharp as a blade. "You're not untouchable, you're accountable. And tonight, you're going to face the reckoning for every line you've crossed." Her words crashed over David like a suffocating wave, wrapping around him like a heavy, leaden shroud. His lips parted, desperate to spit out a defense, a denial, anything to claw back the control slipping away from him, but no sound came. His mouth hung open, useless as his mind raced in circles. Around them, the crowd that had once stood in stunned silence now stirred to life, a low hum of disbelief and fury rippling through the onlookers. A woman near the front, her phone clutched tightly in her hand, flicked it back on, the tiny red light of the camera blinking. As she captured every faltering twitch of David's unraveling composure, she wasn't just recording, she was bearing witness, her jaw set with quiet determination. Her eyes narrowed as if she could see right through the facade he'd spent years building. "You think you can just pull this?" David finally snapped, his voice quaking with a mix of rage and fear, the words tumbling out jagged and unsteady. "You think you're going to ruin my career over this?" His hands clenched into fists at his sides, knuckles whitening as he fought to hold onto the last threads of his dignity. Ryan arched an eyebrow, unfazed by his outburst, her expression cool and unyielding. "You're ruining your own career, officer," she shot back, her voice icy, each syllable dripping with contempt. "I'm just here to make sure every single second of it is caught on record." She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, her posture commanding their attention. "And it looks like there are plenty of people here ready to back me up." David's head jerked toward the onlookers, his eyes wild, searching for an ally. A shred of support, but the faces staring back at him turned away, their expressions hardening into silent condemnation. He felt the ground shift beneath him, his authority crumbling like dry sand slipping through his fingers, cornered, exposed. He scrambled for something to say, anything to regain his footing. "You don't know who you're messing with," he growled, his voice dropping lower, laced with a desperate edge that betrayed his panic. Ryan's lips curled into a faint, chilling smile, her eyes glinting with the certainty of someone who'd seen this play out 100 times before. "Oh, I know exactly who I'm dealing with," she replied, her tone as cold as steel. "I've met your kind over and over again, bullies cloaked in uniforms, drunk on power, and I know precisely how this story ends." Just then, David's radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice slicing through the charged silence like a whip. "Unit 47, report your status." The words hung in the air, demanding a response. But David's hand hovered over the device, trembling. He couldn't bring himself to answer, couldn't summon the strength to pretend he still held the reins. Ryan stepped back, crossing her arms over her chest. Her posture relaxed yet radiating authority as she watched him flounder. "What's it going to be?" "Officer," she asked, her voice calm but piercing. "Are you going to keep digging yourself deeper into this mess? Or are you ready to face the consequences of your actions?" David's eyes darted frantic califers to the crowd, their murmurs growing louder, then back to Ryan, her unflinching stare pinning him in place. He was out of moves, cornered like a wounded animal, and the realization gnawed at him. But surrender, here, in front of all these people, his pride recoiled at the thought. "You're bluffing," he said, the words weak and hollow, lacking any real conviction. Ryan's smile widened, but it was a frigid, humorless thing, devoid of warmth. "Am I?" she countered softly, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out her phone, her fingers moving with deliberate precision as she tapped the screen. Then she turned it toward him, revealing a live call in progressor's supervisor at the FBI, the name and number glowing unmistakably on the display. "Go ahead," she said, her voice steady as granite. "Make your move." David stared at the screen, his face crumpling into a mask of raw defeat. The crowd fell silent, holding its breath as the weight of his downfall settled over them all. He had lost this badge, his uniform. The towering authority he'd wielded with such reckless abandon it all meant nothing now. The onlookers erupted into a chorus of murmurs, some shouting encouragement to Ryan, their voices ringing with admiration, while others hurled sharp rebukes at David, their anger unrestrained. He stumbled backward, his hand dropping limply to his side, the fight draining out of him. Ryan stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper meant only for him. "This isn't over, Harding," she said, her words carrying a promise, "not by a long shot. You've got a mountain of sins to answer for, and I'll be there every step of the way to make sure you do." David couldn't respond. The man who had stormed into this confrontation brimming with arrogance and swagger now stood, shattered, a hollow shell of the figure he'd once projected. Ryan turned to the crowd, lifting her badge high, the metal glinting under the streetlights. "Thank you all for standing with me," she said, her voice firm yet laced with gratitude. "If any of you recorded what happened here tonight, please hold on to it. We're going to need every piece of evidence to see this through." The woman with the phone nodded eagerly, her face alight with fierce resolve, her grip tightening on the device as if it were a weapon of justice itself. Ryan offered her a fleeting nod, a spark of appreciation breaking through her steely demeanor. But she didn't linger. There was work still to be done, a battle far from finished, and she wouldn't rest until the scales of justice were balanced. As Ryan strode away, the crowd parted before her, their eyes trailing her with a mixture of awe and reverence. Behind her, David Harding stood alone, the wreckage of his world crashing down around him in slow, deafening silence. His badge, once a symbol of power, now felt like a lead weight dragging him under. The murmurs of the onlookers swelled, their collective judgment forming an invisible cage around him. He wasn't accustomed to this, though, being the one judged, the one stripped of control. His chest tightened, his breath shallow as the reality sank in. The narrative he'd always dictated had been ripped from his hands. But then, as Ryan's figure receded into the distance, David found his voice again, rough and ragged with desperation. "Wait," he called after her, his tone a tangled mess of fury and dread. She paused mid-step, turning slowly, her face an unreadable mask as the crowd hushed once more, sensing the confrontation wasn't yet over. "Excuse me," she said, her voice low and dangerously calm, carrying an edge that made the air itself feel sharp. "What exactly do you think I'm walking away from?" David's hands twitched at his sides, his jaw clenching as he scrambled for words to claw back some semblance of power. "You think you can ruin me?" he spat, his voice breaking under the strain. "You think this little show is going to?" Ryan cut him off, her words slicing through his like a guillotine. "This isn't a show, Harding," she said, stepping closer, her presence towering despite her steady calm. "This is accountability you've spent your life dodging, something you've never had to face until now." David flinched, her words striking him like blows, but his pride surged up, refusing to let him crumble completely. "You don't know me," he hissed, his voice trembling with defiance. "You don't know what I've been through to get here." For a fleeting moment, Ryan's eyebrows lifted. A flicker of something pity, perhaps, or a faint curiosity crossing her face. But it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by an unrelenting resolve. "You're right," she said, her tone even but cutting. "I don't know you, but I know men like you men who think that badge gives them the right to decide who's worthy and who's not, who use their power to crush, to control, to degrade. And I've dedicated my life to making sure they pay for it." Her words thundered down on him, each one peeling back another layer of his crumbling defenses. He opened his mouth to argue, to fight back, but Ryan pressed on, her voice a relentless tide. "You've been hiding behind that uniform for years, wielding it like a shield. But it doesn't make you untouchable. It doesn't make you righteous. It doesn't shield you from the truth, and the truth is, you've abused your power, twisted it into something ugly, and now the consequences are here, staring you in the face." The crowd murmured in agreement, their voices a rising tide of support, their eyes boring into David with unwavering judgment. He glanced around, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead as his bravado slipped further into the abyss. He was trapped, a man ensnared by his own actions, and the weight of it crushed him. "Why are you doing this?" he asked at last, his voice softer now, almost a plea, the last gasp of a man with nowhere left to run. "What do you want from me?" Ryan tilted her head, studying him as if he were a puzzle she'd already solved. For the first time, a small, bitter smile curved her lips, tinged with the weariness of someone who'd fought this fight too many times. "What do I want?" she echoed, her voice quiet but resonant. "I want justice. I want you to feel the weight of what you've done, to understand what it's like to stand on the other side of that power you've abused. I want you to know that no badge, no uniform, no hollow threats can protect you from the consequences of your choices." The lesson hung heavy in the air. Justice wasn't just a word, but a force unyielding and impartial. And the abuse of power carried a price that no one could escape forever. David stood frozen, his world reduced to the echo of her words and the eyes of the crowd bearing witness to his fall. Ryan turned away once more, her steps purposeful, leaving him to drown in the wreckage of his own making. For her, this was more than a single victory. It was a stand against a system that too often sheltered men like him, a reminder that accountability could pierce even the thickest armor of corruption. And for David, it was the beginning of a long, inescapable descent, a mirror held up to the consequences of his own hubris. The sting of powerlessness clawed at David Harding as he stood there, defenseless, stripped bare of the dignity he'd once worn like armor. It wasn't a physical blow that brought him to this moment, but something far sharper, piercing truth that his authority, his very identity, had been wielded to diminish others simply because their skin didn't match his own. His hazel eyes widened in shock, pupils dilating as if trying to take in the enormity of the accusation. It hit him like a fist to the stomach, knocking the wind out of him, leaving his breath shallow and ragged. He parted his lips, a protest forming on his tongue, desperate to reclaim some semblance of control, to argue that this wasn't who he was. But then he met her gaze, a Special Agent Ryan Carter's, unflinching, steel-gray eyes boring into Hyman. The weight of her stare crushed his defiance into silence. His throat tightened, words dissolving into a bitter lump he couldn't swallow. "This isn't just about you, Harding," Ryan said, her voice softening now, though it carried a quiet strength that reverberated through the still air of the park. She stood tall, her dark blazer catching the faint breeze, her badge glinting in the late morning sun like a beacon of accountability. "This is about every soul you've ever diminished, every individual you've singled out because they didn't conform to your rigid, narrow vision of who gets to belong in this world. This is about ensuring you never wield that power to wound again." Her words hung heavy, each one a stone dropped into the depths of his conscience, rippling outward to stir the muddy waters of his past actions. David couldn't meet her eyes anymore. He turned his head, staring blankly at the cracked pavement beneath his boots, his chest heaving with quick, uneven breaths. Around them, the crowd stood in a hushed circle, a mosaic of faces reflecting a storm of emotions, anger simmering in some, all widening the eyes of others, and a quiet, almost tangible satisfaction settling over those who'd long waited to see the mighty brought low. For years, David had towered over this community, a figure of authority cloaked in the blue of his uniform, his presence a silent threat. Now, he was a man unraveling, and they bore witness to his fall with a mix of disbelief and grim vindication. Ryan took a deliberate step back, her polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel path. She didn't need to say more. The wreckage of her words lay strewn across David's crumbling defenses. He knew it, felt it in the hollow ache spreading through his chest. But as she turned to leave, her figure retreating into the dappled shade of the park's ancient oaks, something broke loose inside him. His voice emerged, fragile and barely audible, a whisper carried on the wind. "I didn't mean for it to go this far." Ryan froze mid-step, her shoulders stiffening beneath her jacket. Slowly, she pivoted, her head tilting just enough for him to catch the unreadable mask of her expression. The sunlight caught the sharp lines of her jaw, casting shadows that deepened the mystery of her thoughts. "What did you mean, then?" she asked, her tone cutting through the air sharp, yet laced with a faint thread of something gentler, not quite kindness, but an invitation to truth. David faltered, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, then releasing as if unsure of their purpose. His knuckles whitened, then flushed pink again, a silent dance of tension and surrender. "I don't know," he stammered, his voice cracking like dry timber underfoot. "I don't know anymore." The admission hung between them, Ryan unguarded, a confession torn from a man who'd spent years hiding behind certainty. For a moment, the world held its breath. Ryan's piercing gaze searched his face, tracing the lines of exhaustion etched into his brow, the faint tremble at the corner of his mouth. She saw it thin a flicker of sincerity, small but real, buried beneath layers of arrogance and denial. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make her pause, to temper the fire in her chest with a sliver of hope. "You've got a long road ahead of you," she said at last, her voice low but steady, each word measured like a judge's gavel. "If you're serious about changing, it starts with facing everything you've done, all of it, without excuses." David nodded, a slow, mechanical motion, his eyes dropping to the ground once more. The grass blurred beneath his boots, patches of green streaked with dirt, a mirror to the mess he'd made of himself. "I don't even know where to start," he murmured, the words barely escaping his lips, as if speaking them aloud might shatter him entirely. Ryan's expression softened, just a fraction, the hard edges of her resolve giving way to a fleeting glimpse of empathy. "Start by listening," she said, her voice carrying the weight of a lifeline. "To the people you've hurt, to the voices you've drowned out with your own. Then do better prove it with every step you take." With that, she turned again, her stride purposeful now, cutting through the crowd that parted for her like the Red Sea. Their murmurs followed her, subdued and reverent, a quiet acknowledgement of the force she'd become in that moment. David remained rooted to the spot, alone in the center of the dissipating throng, his head bowed low, the weight of his choices pressed down on him, a burden no badge could shield him from any longer. His broad shoulders slumped, the crisp lines of his uniform now a crumpled shell around a man confronting the ruins of his own making. Justice had arrived, not with fanfare, but with the quiet inevitability of truth, and it left him exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never imagined possible. As Ryan exited the park, the crunch of gravel faded into the hum of the world resuming its rhythm. Joggers pounded the paths once more, their sneakers slapping against the earth in steady beats. Parents called out to children who darted between trees, their laughter piercing the air like birdsong. The faint chatter of a community stirring back to life filled the spaces between, a fragile normalcy settling over the scene. Yet for Ryan, the victory tasted bittersweet. Satisfaction coursed through her, yes, a deep, resonant chord struck by seeing justice take root, but it mingled with a bone-deep weariness that tugged at her limbs. This was but one skirmish in an endless war, a single thread pulled from the tangled fabric of systemic wrongs. For now, though, it was enough. She'd planted a seed, and the fight would press on. For those who'd lingered to watch the clash unfold, the return to routine felt hollow. A thin veneer stretched over the raw emotions still churning beneath. The confrontation between Officer David Harding and Special Agent Ryan Carter had cracked something open, a fissure through which questions and unease seeped, too potent to ignore. They dispersed slowly, casting glances back at David, who stood motionless by his patrol car. The radio on his shoulder crackled faintly, unanswered calls buzzing like flies around a wound. He turned his back to the retreating crowd, his hands gripping the edge of the car door until his knuckles strained white. The adrenaline that had once fueled him drained away, leaving only the echo of Ryan's words slicing deeper with every replay. "You've been hiding behind that uniform for years," she'd said, her voice calm but unrelenting. "This is about every person you've ever made feel small." The accusations rang in his ears, louder now, a relentless chorus stripping away the illusions he'd built around himself. He'd always seen himself as untouchably a man who bent the world to his will. With the authority of his badge and the menace of his presence, intimidation had been his currency. Control his kingdom. But now that kingdom lay in ashes, and the badge pinned to his chest felt less like a shield and more like a brand of shame, searing into his flesh with every breath. The park blurred around him, the trees and paths melting into a haze as his mind spiraled inward, grappling with the man he'd become. Across town, Ryan sat in the stillness of her office at the FBI field station, the half-drawn blinds slicing the late morning light into slivers that stretched across her desk. Papers lay scattered before her, reports and case files she'd pushed aside to confront David that morning. The encounter had unfolded precisely as she'd planned, each move calculated, each word a blade honed to cut through his defenses. Yet the aftermath weighed on her more than she'd expected. She'd faced men like David before, some more ruthless, others more cunning, but this time, the emotional toll lingered like smoke after a fire. Leaning back in her chair, she reached for her phone, her fingers brushing the cool glass as she unlocked the screen. Already, the confrontation was rippling across the digital landscape, videos proliferating on social media like wildfire. #SecountWebay justice flooded her feed, accompanied by clips of her holding up her badge, her voice steady and commanding as she dismantled David's authority. His defeated expression, captured in grainy footage, stared back at her, a portrait of a man undone. The comments were a battlefield of their own, for every voice praising her courage, thanking her for standing against the abuse of power. There was another spitting venom accusing her of overreach, of publicly humiliating a man who was just doing his job. She scrolled through them, her jaw tightening, until a sharp knock at the door jolted her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Special Agent in Charge James Porter framed in the doorway, his gray hair stark against the crisp black of his suit. At 58, Porter carried the gravitas of decades in the bureau, his steady presence a rare anchor in Ryan's often turbulent career. He'd been her mentor, one of the few she trusted implicitly, and now he stepped inside, closing the door with a soft click. "You've been busy," he said, his voice dry but warm, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth as he crossed his arms. Ryan set her phone down, the screen dimming as she leaned back further, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp. "You could say that." Porter took a seat across from her, his gaze steady and appraising. "It's all over the news. They're calling you a hero." She raised an eyebrow, skepticism flickering across her features. "Not everyone." He sighed, settling into the chair with the ease of someone who'd weathered countless storms. "You knew this would kick up a hornet's nest." "I did," she admitted, her tone firm but reflective. "But it wasn't about making a scene. That officer needed to face the music, and I wasn't about to let him slip away without answering for what he's done." Porter nodded slowly, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest. "I'm with you on that. But this isn't just about David Harding anymore. It's about the whole rotten system that let him act that way for years. And now, all eyes are on you." Ryan tilted her head, her eyes narrowing as she weighed his words. "You think I went too far?" "No," he said quickly, his voice resolute. "But others will. The department's already fielding custody officials, the police union, even a couple of senators. They're not digging into David's record. They're questioning why we stepped in." A bitter laugh escaped her, sharp and fleeting. "Of course they are. Heaven forbid we hold one of their own accountable." Porter leaned forward, his expression turning grave. "You've rattled the cage, Ryan, and that's a damn good thing. But it means the blowback's coming. You need to brace yourself." Her gaze locked with his, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest. "I've been ready for this fight my entire career." He smiled faintly, pride glinting in his eyes like sunlight on steel. I know you have. Just don't forget this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. Meanwhile, across the city, David sat alone in the precinct locker room, the harsh fluorescent lights casting a cold, unforgiving glow over the dull gray walls. His uniform lay discarded on the bench beside him, a crumpled heap of blue fabric that no longer felt like a second skin. For the first time in years, he felt naked without it, stripped of the identity he'd clung to so fiercely. The precinct hummed with subdued activity whispers slithering through the halls, sit-along glances darting his way from colleagues who'd seen the videos, who'd watched him be torn down in front of the world. He could feel their judgment, their curiosity, their quiet glee at his humiliation. His hands rested on his knees, fingers twitching as if searching for something to hold onto. But there was nothing left to grasp. The lesson of that morning burned through him, a slow, searing realization that justice wasn't just a word, it was a reckoning. For every life he'd diminished, every ounce of power he'd abused, there was a price, and he was paying it now. The consequences of his actions stretched beyond him, a warning etched into the air for anyone who dared to follow his path. Ryan had wielded justice not as a weapon of vengeance, but as a mirror, forcing him to see the man he'd become and the man he might still choose to be. The road ahead was daunting, shadowed by guilt and uncertainty, but for the first time, David felt the faint stirrings of something new, a chance, however slim, to atone. In the midst of a restless crowd, some faces glowed with a twisted satisfaction at his unraveling, their eyes glinting with the thrill of witnessing a mighty figure topple. Others, however, darted nervously, their footsteps quick and deliberate as they tried to erase any trace of their once close ties to him. David stood motionless in the dimly lit bathroom of the precinct, his gaze locked on the fractured reflection staring back at him from the cracked mirror. Above the sink, the man in the glass felt like a stranger, his features sagged with exhaustion, his eyes dulled by defeat, his posture slumped as though the weight of his own existence had finally caught up with him. For years, he had meticulously sculpted an identity rooted in authority, in the unyielding grip of control, a persona that commanded respect and silenced dissent. Now, that carefully constructed facade crumbled around him, leaving nothing but an empty husk where pride once resided. His chest tightened as he traced the lines of his unfamiliar face, wondering how it had come to this, how the man he'd fought so hard to become had slipped through his fingers like sand. The sharp creak of the door swinging open jolted him from his spiraling thoughts. Detective Maria Alvarez stepped into the room, her presence a quiet storm of resolve. She was a woman of razor-sharp intellect, her no-nonsense demeanor softened only by the faintest hint of compassion. In her dark eyes a rarity in a precinct hardened by cynicism, Maria was one of the few colleagues David genuinely admired. Her reputation as one of the force's finest detectives earned through grit and an unwavering moral compass. "David," she said, her voice steady yet carrying an edge of formality, "the chief wants to see you." Her tone betrayed nothing, no judgment, no pity, just the blunt delivery of a fact. David nodded mutely, his fingers brushing against the stiff fabric of his uniform jacket as he grabbed it from the hook. He didn't put it on, it hung limp in his hand, a relic of a role he no longer felt entitled to claim. As they walked down the corridor toward the chief's office, the air grew thick with the hum of hushed voices. Whispers slithered through the precinct like snakes, coiling around him, their venom laced with scorn. He could feel the piercing weight of every stare, each glance a silent accusation that bore into his skin, stripping away what little dignity he had left. When they reached the office, Chief Donnelly sat behind his imposing oak desk, his weathered face a map of decades spent navigating the treacherous terrain of law enforcement. His silver hair caught the faint light filtering through the blinds, and his deep-set eyes studied David with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, more suffocating. The chief was a grizzled veteran, his presence commanding yet inscrutable, a man who had seen too much to be easily rattled. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him with a flick of his hand. David complied, his movements rigid, as though his body resisted every step toward this inevitable reckoning. Donnelly leaned back in his creaky leather chair, his fingers steepled as he regarded David in silence for what felt like an eternity. The quiet stretched thin, taut with unspoken tension, until the chief finally spoke. "David, we've got a problem," he said, his voice low and deliberate, each word landing like a stone. David stared down at his hands, clasped tightly in his lap, the faint tremor in his fingers betraying the storm brewing inside him. "I know," he murmured, his voice barely audible, a fragile thread of sound swallowed by the room's heavy atmosphere. "No, I don't think you do," Donnelly snapped, his tone sharpening like a blade drawn from its sheath. "This isn't just about you. This is about the entire department. Your actions have dragged us all into the spotlight, and now I've got brass breathing down my neck, demanding explanations I don't have." David's stomach churned, a sickening twist of guilt and dread knotting his insides. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said, his words trembling with the desperation of a man grasping at excuses. Donnelly scoffed, the sound harsh and dismissive. "That's not good enough, David. You crossed a linear line you damn well knew was there, and now we're all paying for it." The chief's words sliced through him, each syllable a reminder of the consequences he could no longer outrun. David's chest constricted, his breath shallow as the reality of his fall sank deeper into his bones. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice hollow, stripped of its former confidence. Donnelly sighed, leaning forward, his elbows resting heavily on the desk. "You're suspended. Effective immediately. Internal Affairs is launching a full investigation, and depending on what they dig up, you could be looking at more than just a slap on the wrist." The words landed like a gavel strike, final and unyielding. David nodded, numb to the core, the inevitability of it all washing over him. He had braced himself for this moment, yet hearing it spoken aloud turned the abstract fear into a concrete truth he couldn't escape. "You brought this on yourself," Donnelly added, his voice softening slightly, tinged with a trace of regret. "I don't know what you were thinking out there, David, but it's clear you forgot what this badge means, what it's supposed to stand for." David had no reply. His tongue felt leaden, his mind a chaotic swirl of shame and self-loathing. For the first time, he couldn't muster a defense, couldn't conjure a single justification to shield himself from the weight of his choices. As he rose and left the office, the precinct seemed to shift around him, colder, emptier, a hollow shell mirroring the man he'd become, stripped of purpose, of the identity he'd clung to like a lifeline. David Harding felt truly powerless, a sensation as foreign as it was devastating. Later that evening, he sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, the worn leather couch creaking beneath his weight. The blinds were drawn tight, casting long, jagged shadows across the room, the faint hum of the city outside muffled by the thick walls. His uniform hung draped over the back of a chair, its crisp lines and polished badge now a cruel mockery of the pride it once represented. The echoes of the day reverberated in his men Donnelly's cutting authority, the crowd's jeering murmurs, the sting of humiliation that clung to every memory like damp rot. He picked up his phone with trembling hands, hesitating before unlocking the screen. The news feeds blazed with his disgrace, every major outlet splashing his name across their headlines. Grainy videos captured the confrontation in stark detail, framing him as the villain he'd spent years convincing himself he wasn't. The captions varied in wording, but not in intent. FBI agent exposes police misconduct. In explosive public showdown. Below, the comments were a merciless barrage, strangers picking apart his actions, his career, even the tired lines etched into his face. "This guy's been a loose cannon forever, should been 10 years ago," one read. "Another power-tripping cop finally gets his comeuppance," said another. "Justice is overdue." His grip tightened around the phone, his knuckles whitening as fury surged through him. Hot and reckless, but there was no outlet for it this time and no badge to wield, no authority to silence the chorus of condemnation. The anger fizzled into something darker, a gnawing realization he'd spent years dodging. This was his doing, his unraveling, his truth. A sharp knock at the door shattered his spiraling thoughts. He froze, his heart thudding against his ribs, before dragging himself to his feet. His steps were slow, each one a battle against the heaviness that had settled into his limbs. When he opened the door, Maria Alvarez stood there, her silhouette framed by the faint glow of the hallway light. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of calm that hid whatever storm might be brewing beneath. "Maria," he croaked, his voice rough and raw from disuse. What are you doing here? She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping inside with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she belonged anywhere she chose to be. Her sharp eyes swept over the cluttered apartment, the empty takeout containers littering the counter, the half-empty bottle of whiskey on the coffee table, the air thick with the stale scent of neglect. I figured I'd find you here, wallowing in your own mess, she said, her tone straddling the line between bluntness and understanding. David shut the door and leaned against it, his shoulders slumping under an invisible weight. So, what, you came to gloat? He muttered, a bitter edge creeping into his words. Maria turned to face him, arms crossed, her stance unwavering. No, David. I came because you need to hear the truth, and I'm probably the only one left who'll give it to you straight. He let out a dry, humorless laugh, the sound scraping against the silence. Great. Another lecture. Go ahead, then tell me how I screwed everything up. Maria stepped closer, her voice dropping to a low, forceful timbre that cut through his defiance. You didn't just screw up today, David. You've been screwing up for years. Today was just the first time someone shoved it in your face loud enough that you couldn't drown it out. Her words landed like a fist to his gut, knocking the breath from him. He looked away, unable to meet her piercing gaze, the shame curling tighter round his chest. I didn't mean for any of this, he said, his voice cracking, a plea disguised as an excuse. Maria's eyes narrowed, her tone sharpening. That's your fallback. You didn't mean to profile her. You didn't mean to flex your badge to scare her into submission. Come on, David. You're better than Thader, at least. You used to be. Am I? He shot back, his voice rising with a sudden, desperate heat. Because right now, I feel like a goddamn failure, Maria. Like everything I've built is just gone. Her gaze softened, just a flicker, but her resolve didn't waver. You're not a failure, David. Not yet. But you've lost yourself, and if you don't figure out how to climb out of this hole, you will be. He sank back onto the couch, burying his face in his hands, the rough calluses of his palms pressing against his skin. I don't even know where to start, he admitted, his voice muffled, small. Maria sat across from him, her posture softening as she leaned forward slightly. You start by facing all of it. Not just what happened today, but who you've turned into. When did you decide the badge was a free pass to play God? The question hung in the air, heavy and accusing, and he didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, thick with the ghosts of choices he'd buried deep. Finally, he lifted his head, his eyes red-rimmed and glistening with a mix of rage and sorrow. You think I wanted to be this person? I didn't join up to hurt people, Maria. She tilted her head, pressing gently but relentlessly. Then why did you? What were you chasing out there? He opened his mouth to fire back, but the words caught in his throat, snagged on a truth he'd spent years running from. When he spoke, his voice was a whisper, fragile and raw. I wanted it to mean something. I wanted them to respect me. Maria leaned back, her expression shifting to something softer, almost pitying. Respect doesn't come from fear, David. It comes from integrity, from doing what's right, even when it's messy, even when it costs you. His shoulders sagged further, the weight of her words pressing down like a physical force. I don't know if I can fix this, he said, his voice barely audible. You don't have a choice. She replied, her tone firm but not unkind. You owe it to yourself and to every person you've stepped onto. Try. Across town, the city buzzed with the fallout of David's actions, a ripple effect that touched lives he'd never considered. The woman he'd profiledrian, a fiercely determined FBI agent with a quiet strength, sat in a bustling coffee shop, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. Her dark hair fell in loose waves around her face, and her sharp eyes scanned the room, always alert, always calculating. She'd known the risks of calling David out in public, had felt the tremor of adrenaline as she'd stood her ground, her voice steady despite the crowd's growing unrest. Now, as she sipped her coffee, the weight of her decision settled over her, not regret, but a quiet resolve. She'd exposed more than just one man's abuse of power. She'd lit a match under a system, too comfortable with its shadows. Ryan wasn't naive. She knew the backlash would come, the whispers of troublemaker already trailing her name. But she'd seen too many like David, men who wielded their authority like a weapon, leaving wreckage in their wake. if her actions forced even a flicker of accountability. It was worth it. Back in his apartment, David sat in the dim glow of a single lamp, Maria's words echoing in his mind. The lesson was brutal but clear. Power without justice was a hollow throne, destined to collapse. His abuse of it hadn't just cost him his badge, it had stripped him of his humanity, leaving him to face the consequences alone. For the first time, he saw the depth of his fall, not as a punishment, but as a chance to rebuild, to reclaim the man he'd once aspired to be. Whether he could rise from the ashes, though, remained a question only time and his own resolve could answer. On a crisp March morning in 2025, Carter hunched over a worn wooden table in a cozy, dimly lit cafe, her laptop casting a faint blue glow across her tired face. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint scent of rain, drifting in from the open window, but her focus wavered. She was supposed to be combing through the dense reports from her latest cases, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, yet her mind kept spiraling back to the electrifying confrontation with David Harding. Earlier that day, it had been brewing for months, years. Evan, a storm of tension finally unleashed in a clash of words and wills. Now, with the dust settled, an unshakable unease gnawed at her. Like a splinter lodged deep to ignore, her phone jolted her from her reverie, buzzing insistently against the table. She glanced down, her breath catching as she saw the message from her brother Marcus. Saw the video. Proud of you, sis, but watch your back. Guys like him don't just turn over a new leaf. Carter's lips twitched into a fleeting smile, her fingers tapping out a quick reply, thanks, I get it. But the truth lingered, heavy and unspoken. She didn't know what David might do next. Men like him, cloaked in arrogance and armored by years of unchecked power, rarely paused to question themselves. Yet, during their showdown, she'd caught something in his eyes, a fleeting shadow of shame, maybe even the ghost of regret. It wasn't much, just a flicker, but it rooted her to the spot, her thoughts churning. The cafe door creaked open, and James Porter, her supervisor, strode in, his presence cutting through the haze of her introspection. He slid into the chair across from her, cradling a steaming mug of coffee, his sharp eyes softening with concern as he studied her. You look like you're hauling the world on your shoulders, he said, his voice warm but laced with a quiet worry that made her chest tighten. Carter managed a faint smile, the edges of her exhaustion showing, just sorting through it all. She murmured, her gaze drifting to the window where raindrops streaked the glass. Porter took a slow sip, the steam curling upward as he nodded. You handled today like a pro, Ryan. But I know your mind's already racing ahead to what's next. She met his eyes, her thoughts sharpening into focus. It's not enough to stop at one guy, James. This isn't just about David, it's the whole damn system that props up people like him, letting them run wild. Her voice grew firm, a spark igniting behind her weariness. Porter leaned in, his expression turning grave, the lines on his face deepening. And what's your move? He asked, his tone a challenge wrapped in encouragement. Carter's jaw set, resolve flooding her like a rising tide. I'm making sure this doesn't get buried. David's not the first to abuse his badge, and he won't be the last. But if we can nail him to the wall, maybe it'll ripple out the world that power doesn't mean you're untouchable. Porter's lips curved into a faint, approving smile. You're a force of nature, you know that, relentless as hell. Carter smirked, a glint of pride flickering in her eyes. Learn from the best, she shot back, and for a moment, the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. The next day, David Harding sat stiffly in a sterile counseling room, the air thick with the scent of antiseptic and the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. His suspension had landed him here, a mandatory step he'd rather have skipped. Dr. Elaine Harper, a middle-aged black woman with a calm presence and piercing eyes, greeted him with a smile that was both welcoming and unyielding. Mr. Harding, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, her voice smooth as polished stone. Take a seat. I hear you've had quite a week. David slumped into the chair, arms crossed tight over his chest, his posture screaming defiance. Yeah, you could say that, he muttered, bitterness dripping from every word. Dr. Harper tilted her head, her gaze steady as she assessed him, unfazed by his walls. Why don't you tell me what went down? She prompted, her tone gentle but insistent, like a river wearing down rock. David bristled, his defenses flaring. "You've seen the news of Orion has. What's the point?" he snapped, his voice rough with frustration. She didn't flinch. "The news spins a story," she replied evenly. "I want your version what you think happened." His frown deepened, his eyes dropping to the scuffed linoleum floor. Silence stretched between them, heavy and taut, until he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I lost it, got pissed, and let it take over. Doctor." Harper leaned forward slightly, her curiosity sharpening. "And why do you think that happened?" David's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles whitening as he groped for an answer. "I don't know. Maybe I've just been mad for a long time too long." Her eyes narrowed, probing deeper. "Mad at what?" She pressed, her voice soft but unrelenting. He hesitated, his jaw tightening as memories and resentments bubbled up. "At everything," he admitted, the words spilling out like a confession he hadn't meant to make. "The world, the way it's always stacked against me." Dr. Harper's face remained composed, but a quiet empathy flickered in her gaze. "And you think that makes it okay to unload that on other people?" David's head snapped up, guilt flashing across his features. "No," he said quickly, his voice thick with regret. "No, it doesn't. I know that." She didn't let up. "Then why do you keep doing it?" Her question hung in the air, sharp and inescapable. David met her eyes, and for the first time, the armor he'd worn for years began to crack. "Because I didn't know what else to do," he confessed, his voice breaking under the weight of his own admission. Dr. Harper nodded slowly, a glimmer of approval in her expression. "That's something," she said. "Owning it is where it starts. But now comes the hard part, figuring out how to change." David's breath hitched, doubt creeping in. "I don't even know if I can." Her gaze softened, but her resolve didn't waver. "You can. It's not quick, and it's not easy. It'll take grit and time. But you've got to want it." He nodded, her words sinking into him like stones settling in deep water. For the first time in years, a faint spark of possibility flickered in his chest. Fragile, but there. Weeks later, the courtroom loomed like a cathedral of judgment, its silence thick and oppressive. Every creak of a bench or shuffle of feet amplified in the stillness. David sat at the defense table, his shoulders rigid, his face drained of color, a man staring down the wreckage of his life. The trial had been a brutal marathon, testimony after testimony, witnesses laying bare his failures, evidence piling up like bricks in a wall built by Ryan Carter and her relentless team. Now, the verdict loomed, the final note in a symphony of reckoning. Across the room, Ryan sat with her colleagues, her posture steady, but her eyes alive with anticipation. She'd poured everything into this case, stitching it together with precision and fury. Because it was bigger than David, it was a strike against the system that shielded the powerful and crushed the weak. The bailiff's voice cut through the tension as the judge entered, a stern woman with silver hair and a gaze that could pierce steel. Everyone rose, the air crackling with unspoken stakes. David's heart thundered in his chest, his fists clenched beneath the table, sweat beading on his brow as he braced for the blow. The judge settled into her seat, her eyes sweeping the room before she spoke, her voice clear and unwavering. "After careful deliberation, the jury has reached a unanimous decision." David held his breath, the weight of every stare pressing down on him. For once, he didn't care about their judgment, he just wanted the torment to end. "On the charge of misconduct under color of law," she continued, "the defendant is found guilty." A ripple of relief and shock swept through the room. Ryan shut her eyes for a fleeting moment, letting the victory wash over here, a hard-won step toward justice. David slumped forward, the reality of his downfall crashing into him like a tidal wave. The judge's voice pressed on, firm and resolute. "Officer Harding, your abuse of authority has inflicted pain, not only on those you targeted, but on the trust people, placing those sworn to protect them. You are sentenced to 2 years of community service, mandatory rehabilitation training, and a permanent revocation of your law enforcement credentials." The punishment wasn't the harshest it could have been, but Ryan saw its power. It stripped David of the shield he'd misused, ensuring he'd never wield that authority again. It was a crack in the armor of unchecked power, a lesson etched in consequences. As the courtroom emptied, David lingered, his mind a storm of regret and fear. Maria Alvarez, a junior member of Ryan's team, approached him, her face unreadable. "It's done," she said simply, her voice cutting through his haze. David nodded, his throat tight. "Not for me," he rasped. "This is just the start." Maria studied him, her dark eyes weighing his words. "Then make it matter," she replied. "You've got a shot to fix this and everyone does." He didn't answer, but her words clung to him as he shuffled out, heavy with the chance he'd been handed. Months later, David stood in the heart of a bustling community center, the chatter of voices and the scent of coffee filling the air. Surrounded by faces he'd once dismissed, people he'd ignored or worse felt exposed, raw. His sentence required him to speak at forums like this, to face the community and unpack the dangers of bias and power run amok. As he stepped to the podium, his hands trembling slightly, he glanced out at the crowd. Among them were people he'd wronged, their eyes a mix of skepticism and curiosity. He cleared his throat, the weight of his past pressing down, but also the faint hope Dr. Harper had planted months ago. "I'm not here because I wanted to be," he began, his voice rough but steady. "I'm here because I screwed up, because I let anger and power twist me into someone I didn't even recognize. And I hurt people." The room was silent, but it wasn't the heavy silence of the courtroom. This was something else, a space for truth to breathe. Across town, Ryan sat in her office, a new case file open before her. But her thoughts drifted to David's journey. She'd fought for justice, not just to punish, but to force a reckoning that might ripple beyond one man. The lesson was clear: power without accountability was a poison, and justice, when served, could carve a path to something better, even for the fallen. In the heart of downtown Arlington, where the relentless hum of city life pulsed through the streets, the air crackled with a tension far heavier than the usual clamor of honking cars and vendors hawking their wares. The evening sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the pavement as commuters hurried home, oblivious to the storm brewing just steps away from the courthouse steps. Amid this chaotic symphony of urban routine, a single man emerged from the grand building, his polished shoes clicking against the stone with a rhythm that spoke of purpose. Jeremiah Carter, a black civil rights lawyer whose name carried weight in every corner of the fight against injustice, adjusted his silk tie with a quiet sigh. His broad shoulders bore the victories of countless courtroom battles, but his dark eyes held a flicker of weariness, a silent testament to the endless war he waged against a system that too often turned its back on people like him. He'd just won another case, a grueling showdown exposing police misconduct that left a grieving family clutching at gratitude through their tears. As he stepped into the cool evening air, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Fishing it out, he saw a text from his assistant, Maya, glowing on the screen. "Great job today, boss." That case was airtight. The family's so thankful. A faint smile tugged at his lips, softening the sharp lines of his face. For a moment, he let himself feel the warmth of triumph, a rare respite from the weight he carried. But that fleeting peace shattered as a police cruiser screeched to a halt, its tires skidding against the curb with a sound like a banshee's wail. The vehicle lurched to block his path to his sleek black sedan, its headlights glaring like predatory eyes. The door flew open, and out stepped Officer Rick Donovan, a name that sent a jolt of recognition through Jeremiah's chest. Donovan was a fixture in whispered complaints around the city, a man whose badge seemed to grant him immunity from the consequences of racial profiling and unchecked brutality. His broad frame loomed as he strode forward, hand resting on the holster at his hip, his pale eyes narrowing as they raked over Jeremiah's tailored suit and gleaming watch. "Hey, you," Donovan barked, his voice a gravelly snarl cutting through the evening din. "What do you think you're doing here?" The question dripped with suspicion, as though Jeremiah's very presence was a crime. Jeremiah's pulse quickened, a familiar rhythm born from years of navigating a world that too often saw him as a threat. He raised his hands slightly, palms open, a gesture drilled into him since childhood, a shield against the unpredictability of men like Donovan. "Officer, is there a problem?" he asked, his tone calm but edged with steel, a practiced balance between deference and dignity. Inside, his mind raced, cataloging every detail, the angle of Donovan's stance, The twitch of his fingers near the gun, the growing murmur of the crowd beginning to take notice. Donovan sneered, his lip curling as if Jeremiah's composure offended him. "You don't belong here. Buddy, I've been watching you fancy types strutting out of that courthouse like you own the damn place. What are you up to casing cars, selling something shady?" The accusation was absurd, laced with a venom that made Jeremiah's stomach twist. He blinked, momentarily stunned by the raw prejudice spilling from Donovan's mouth. But he forced his breath to steady. Years in the courtroom had taught him that rage rarely won against ignorance. "I'm an attorney," he said evenly, reaching slowly for his wallet, telegraphing every move to avoid escalation. "I just finished a case inside." But Donovan wasn't listening. His hand snapped from the holster to the grip of his gun, his voice rising to a jagged pitch. "Don't move. Keep your hands where I can see them." The command sliced through the air, drawing gasps from the gathering onlookers. Phones emerged from pockets, their tiny screens glinting as they began to record the unfolding nightmare. Jeremiah's heart thudded against his ribs, a drumbeat of dread he'd felt too many times before it as a lawyer, but as a black man caught in the crosshairs of power unchecked. "Officer, I'm complying," he said, lifting his hands higher, his voice a lifeline of calm amid the storm. "There's no need for this." Donovan's face twisted into something harder, something feral. "Shut up," he snapped, yanking his gun free. "Get on the ground." Time seemed to stretch, each second a taut wire ready to snap. Jeremiah hesitated, his mind a battlefield of instinct and reason. He knew his rights years of law school and courtroom victories had armed him with them. But he also knew the grim reality. Rights meant little when a trigger-happy cop stood 3 feet away. "Officer, I'm not resisting," he said, his words deliberate, a plea woven into the firmness. "Down," Donovan roared, and in that split second, the world erupted. A gunshot tore through the evening, its deafening crack ricocheting off the brick facades of the surrounding buildings. Jeremiah's body jerked as a searing pain ripped through his side, and he crumpled to the pavement, clutching at the wound. Blood bloomed through his crisp white shirt, a crimson flower unfurling against the fabric. The crowd's collective gasp morphed into screams, some frozen in horror, others surging forward as chaos swallowed the scene. Donovan stood there, gun still smoking, his chest heaving as if he couldn't yet grasp the weight of his own actions. Jeremiah's vision blurred, the edges of the world softening into a haze. But his mind clung fiercely to clarity. "This isn't the end," he thought, the words a mantra against the encroaching darkness. "Not yet." His breath came in shallow gasps, each one a battle, as he replayed every case he'd fought, every tearful thank you from families he'd lifted from despair. He'd promised his community he'd keep going, and even now, with the cold pavement beneath him and blood pooling around his fingers, that promise burned brighter than the pain. The crowd's outrage erupted like a tidal wave. "He's a lawyer," a man shouted, his voice raw with disbelief. "You shot an innocent man." Phones stayed trained on Donovan, their lenses unblinking witnesses to the horror. A young black woman, her braids swinging as she stepped closer, held her camera steady, her eyes blazing with defiance. "We've got it all on video, officer," she called out, her voice trembling with fury. "You're done." Her words seemed to pierce Donovan's bravado, a flicker of doubt crossing his face before he masked it with a scowl. Amid the chaos, a woman in faded medical scrubs pushed through the throng, her sneakers pounding the pavement. "I'm a nurse, step back," she yelled, dropping to her knees beside Jeremiah, her hands, steady despite the pandemonium, pressed hard against his wound, her brow furrowing as she fought to slow the bleeding. "Hang on," she whispered, her voice a lifeline threading through his fading consciousness. Jeremiah grimaced, pain lancing through him, but he managed a faint "Thank you," his gratitude a quiet anchor in the storm. Donovan, meanwhile, stood rooted to the spot, his gun still drawn, his face a shifting mask of arrogance and unease. "Step back, all of you," he bellowed at the crowd, his voice cracking at the edges. This man was resisting reach for a weapon. The lie hung heavy in the air, met with a chorus of protests. "He didn't do anything," the young woman with the phone shot back. "We saw everything, you're lying." Her accusation fueled the crowd's roar, their collective anger a force Donovan couldn't ignore. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as two squad cars screeched onto the scene. Officers spilled out, their eyes darting between the bleeding man, the armed cop, and the furious crowd. Donovan waved them over, his voice steadying as he tried to seize control. "Suspect resisted arrest. Reached for what I thought was a weapon," he said. But his eyes betrayed a nervous twitch. The first officer to approach, a Latina sergeant named Martinez, paused, her sharp gaze cutting through the chaos. She took in Jeremiah, now barely conscious, the nurse's hands slick with blood as she worked to keep him alive. Then she turned to the crowd, noting the forest of phones capturing every moment. "Let's get the victim medical attention, Martinez ordered, her voice a whip crack of authority as she signaled for an ambulance. Someone secured Donovan's weapon. Donovan's jaw dropped, his face twisting in disbelief. "What? I'm the officer Hirim in control," he sputtered. Martinez's eyes narrowed, cold and unyielding. "Not anymore," she said, her tone a quiet thunder. She'd heard the rumors about Donovan complaints of brutality that mysteriously vanished, buried under the weight of his badge. But this time, the evidence was inescapable. Dozens of witnesses, a mosaic of videos painting a damning portrait of abuse. Paramedics rushed in, their movements swift and practiced as they lifted Jeremiah onto a stretcher. He winced, pain flaring anew, but he locked eyes with Martinez, his voice a faint threat of determination. "Don't let this get buried," he rasped. She nodded, her expression solemn. "It won't," she promised, and as the ambulance doors slammed shut, whisking him away, Donovan's desperate protests grew shrill. "He was Riachinji, saw it. He could have killed me," he shouted, his words unraveling into a frantic plea. The crowd wasn't swayed. "You had no reason to shoot," a bystander yelled. "He told you he was a lawyer, and you still pulled the trigger. All saw it." Martinez turned to Donovan, her face carved from stone. "Turn over your badge and gun," she said, her voice low but unyielding. "What? You can't be serious," he began, but her glare silenced him. "Now," she snapped. Reluctantly, he complied, his hands trembling as he surrendered the symbols of his power. The crowd's shouts faded into a tense hum as Martinez took charge, her presence a quiet rebuke to the chaos Donovan had unleashed. For Jeremiah, the ride to the hospital was a haze of pain and flickering hope. Each jolt of the ambulance sent fresh agony through his side, but his mind churned with purpose. He thought of the families he'd fought for, the children who'd looked to him as a beacon, the promises he'd made to a community battered by injustice. This wasn't just about him, it was about every soul who'd been silenced by a system that shielded men like Donovan. Justice, he knew, wasn't a gift, it was a battle, and even as his strength waned, he vowed to fight on. Back at the scene, Martinez stood amid the wreckage of the evening, her jaw tight as she watched Donovan shrink under the weight of his actions. She'd seen too many cases like Thisbo abused, lives shattered, consequences dodged. But this time, the tide had turned. The videos would spread, the voices would rise, and the truth would claw its way into the light. For every Jeremiah Carter felled by prejudice, there were countless others ready to stand, to demand accountability, to prove that the cost of wielding power without restraint was a reckoning no badge could deflect. The air in the dimly lit street felt thick with tension, as Officer Rick Donovan's trembling fingers fumbled with the clasp of his badge. For the first time in his career, the cold metal seemed foreign to him, slipping from his grasp as though it knew the weight of what he'd done. A flicker of fear danced in his hazel ice eyes that had once brimmed with unshakable confidence while the distant murmur of voices grew louder. Around him, fellow officers moved with purpose, their boots scuffing against the cracked pavement as they questioned witnesses. Flashlights cut through the night, illuminating faces etched with shock and anger. Bystanders clutched their phones, their shaky hands recording every second of the aftermath, the faint glow of screens reflecting their determination to capture the truth. This wasn't just another fleeting incident destined to dissolve into the shadows of bureaucracy. The videos, the crowd's unwavering accounts, and the sterling reputation of the man lying wound at Jeremiah Carter promised that this moment would burn brightly in the public's memory, a beacon refusing to be extinguished. But for Donovan, denial was his lifeline, a flimsy shield against the storm brewing around him. "This is ridiculous," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation as he paced the scene. His broad shoulders hunched under the weight of scrutiny. That guy was a threat, had to be. You'll all see I was right. His words hung in the air, sharp and defiant, but they landed on deaf ears. The crowd didn't flinch, their gazes cold and unyielding. His fellow officers exchanged uneasy glances, their silence louder than any reprimand. And Sergeant Elena Martinez, standing just a few feet away with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watched him with eyes that pierced through his bravado. Her face remained a mask of calm, but beneath it simmered a fury born of years witnessing abuses of power. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone told Donovan that the world had seen his actions, and justice, though momentarily muffled by the chaos, would not stay silent for long. Across town, the sterile stillness of a hospital room enveloped Jeremiah Carter. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic beep of the heart monitor tethered to his chest, a fragile reminder that he'd cheated death. Pale and weakened, he lay against the starch-white sheets, his dark skin stark against the bandages wrapped around his torso. The surgery to remove Donovan's bullet had been a success, but the doctor's warnings echoed in his ears. Recovery would be a long, grueling road. Yet Jeremiah's mind didn't linger on the pain radiating through his body, or the exhaustion pulling at his limbs. No, his thoughts raced ahead, sharp and unrelenting, fixated on one thing holding Donovan accountable. As he opened his eyes, the harsh fluorescent lights stung, forcing a wince that tugged at the stitches beneath his bandages. Blinking through the discomfort, he noticed a familiar figure at his bedside, Maya Collins, his closest friend and a brilliant lawyer whose no-nonsense demeanor could silence a room. Her arms were folded tightly, her deep brown eyes blazing with a storm of emotions: relief at seeing him alive, fury at the man who'd put him here. "Jeremiah," she said, her voice softening as she leaned forward, her braided hair brushing the edge of the chair. "You scared the hell out of us." A weak smile tugged at his lips, though it took effort to muster. "I'm still here," he rasped, his throat dry but his spirit unbroken. "Can't let Donovan win, can I?" At the mention of that name, Maya's jaw clenched, her fingers digging into her arms as if to steady herself. "He won't," she replied, her tone resolute. "The videos are everywhere already. People are screaming for his badge. Civil rights groups are rallying, organizing marches. This isn't fading away, not this time." Jeremiah nodded faintly, his chest tightening not from the wound, but from the gravity of her words. "Good," he murmured, "but it's not enough to just get him fired. He needs to face the law, Maya. He shot me in cold blood. This isn't just about me, it's about everyone he's hurt, everyone who's suffered because of him." Her hand found his arm, warm and steady, grounding him. "We're already on it," she assured him. "I've been talking to the DA's office, digging into Donovan's history with the local NWCP. His record complaints, excessive force, it's all coming out now. This could be the case that ends him for good." In that instant, Jeremiah's mind spiraled back to the moment that had changed everything. The memory was vivid, searing, Donovan's face contorted with hate, his eyes glinting with a sick satisfaction as he gripped his gun. The way he'd stood there, chest puffed out, relishing the power he wielded, it wasn't a split-second mistake. It was deliberate, a venomous act fueled by racism and arrogance. Jeremiah had seen that look before, in fleeting encounters over the years, but this time he'd stared it down and lived to tell the tale. He'd survived to fight. Meanwhile, in a cramped, fluorescent-lit interrogation room at the precinct, Officer Rick Donovan sat hunched over a scarred metal table. His fists were balled so tightly his knuckles whitened, and his jaw was locked in a stubborn line of defiance. The air smelled faintly of stale coffee and sweat, the walls pressing in as if they to judge him. Across from him sat Sergeant Martinez, her posture rigid, her dark eyes unreadable yet piercing. "You've got nothing on me," Donovan spat, his voice thick with arrogance. Though a tremor betrayed him, that guy was a threat. "I followed procedure." Martinez raised an eyebrow, her lips twitching as if suppressing a laugh. "Procedure?" she echoed, her tone cutting like a blade. "Shooting an unarmed man in broad daylight, with dozens of people filming you, that's your idea of procedure?" Donovan's face flushed red. He was reaching. He snapped, slamming a fist on the table. "I thought he had a weapon." Martinez leaned forward, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. The only thing Jeremiah Carter reached for was his wallet, and you knew it. You saw his suit, heard him say he was a lawyer, and you still pulled that trigger. Why? Because he's black. Because you thought you'd get away with it, like all the other times? Donovan's bravado faltered, his face twisting as he recoiled. You don't know what you're talking about, he growled, but the words lacked bite. With a sudden, sharp motion, Martinez slammed a thick file onto the table, the sound reverberating like a gunshot. Donovan flinched. This is your record, she said, her voice steady and cold. 27 complaints misconduct, racial profiling, excessive force. You've dodged accountability for years, but not this time. The videos, the witnesses, Jeremiah Carter's testimonials all against you. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that didn't exist. You can't prove anything, he muttered, but the conviction had drained from his voice. Martinez smirked, leaning back in her chair. We don't have to. The whole country's watching, and when this is over, you'll wish you'd quit while you were ahead. Outside, the night pulsed with energy as protesters swarmed the precinct steps. Their voices rose in a unified chant: justice for Jeremiah, and police brutality. Their signs swaying like banners of war under the streetlights. Men and women of every race and background stood shoulder to shoulder, their breath fogging in the cool March air, their faces alight with outrage and hope. The incident had sparked a wildfire, its flames licking at the foundations of a system long overdue for reckoning. Back in the hospital, Jeremiah watched the scene unfold on his phone, the grainy live feed trembling with the crowd's fervor. His chest tightened again, not from pain, but from a swell of gratitude and resolve. These people weren't just fighting for him, they were standing for every soul crushed by injustice, every life diminished by unchecked power. Maya returned to his room, a stack of papers clutched in her arms, her eyes gleaming with purpose. You ready to make history? She asked, her voice a quiet challenge. Jeremiah's faint smile widened, his determination a fire that no bullet could extinguish. Let's do it, he said, and in those words lay a promissetto himself to the people outside, to the countless others who'd never gotten their day in court. Weeks later, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a sea of faces packed into every pew. Reporters lined the back, their cameras flashing like lightning, capturing the weight of a case that had gripped the nation. Jeremiah Carter's brush with death had peeled back the layers of systemic rot. And today wasn't just about one man's survival, it was about justice, about dismantling the myth that a badge could shield prejudice. Jeremiah entered slowly, his steps measured but proud, Maya at his side like a sentinel, the bandages beneath his suit pressed against his still healing wound, a silent testament to what he'd endured. The room hushed as he took his place at the prosecution's table, his presence commanding despite his fragility. Across the aisle, Donovan sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the floor, avoiding the man he'd tried to erase. His attorney, Henry Klein, a weary man with graying hair and a perpetual scowl, whispered frantically in his ear, but Donovan's tight jaw betrayed his unease. Judge Alina Morales swept into the room, her black robe billowing as she ascended the bench. Her stern face softened only slightly with fairness as she surveyed the crowd. We are here today for the trial of Rick Donovan, she announced, her voice clear and unyielding. Charged with attempted murder, aggravated assault, and misconduct as an officer of the law. Let us begin. The prosecution sprang into action, Maya at the helm. She played the videos raw, unfiltered glimpses of that fateful day. The footage was merciless, Donovan's aggression, Jeremiah's calm compliance, the deafening crack of the gunshot. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, each frame a dagger in Donovan's defense. Ladies and gentlemen, Maya began, addressing the jury with a voice that carried both fire and steel. This isn't about a misunderstanding or a fleeting error. This is about a man who abused his authority, driven by racial bias, and nearly snuffed out an innocent life. Jeremiah Carter, a black lawyer, a man who posed no threat, who did everything right, was met with violence. Donovan didn't just shoot him, he targeted him, saw his skin before his humanity. This wasn't a lapse, it was hate, pure and deliberate. She stepped closer to the jury, her gaze locking with theirs. And hate has no place in our system, not in justice, not in society. not in the hands of those sworn to protect us. Henry Klein rose, his voice gravelly as he countered, "Your Honor, members of the jury, my client acted in self-defense. He believed he was in danger, a split-second decision in a life-threatening moment." Maya objected swiftly, her words slicing through his argument. "The videos show otherwise." Judge Morales nodded. "Sustained. Mr. Klein, stick to the facts." The defense wavered, leaning on tired excuses that crumbled under scrutiny. Witness after witness, bystanders with trembling voices, officers with reluctant admissions painted a damning picture. Sergeant Martinez took the stand, her testimony a thunderclap. "Donovan's history isn't a secret," she said, her eyes steady. "This isn't one mistake, it's a pattern, ignored for too long." When Jeremiah testified, the room stilled. His voice, though soft, carried the weight of truth. "I did everything I was taught, stayed calm, complied, told him I was a lawyer. It didn't matter. To him, I was guilty the second he saw me." He paused, letting the silence amplify his words. "But I won't let hate win. This case is for everyone who's been targeted, for every time the badge became a weapon instead of a shield." Maya's closing argument was electric, her passion igniting the air. "We've seen the evidence, heard the truth. Donovan didn't act out of fear, acted out of hate. And that hate ends here, today, with your verdict." The lesson was clear. Justice, though slow, could roar when fueled by truth. And the consequences of wielding power without accountability, they loomed over Donovan like a shadow he could no longer outrun. The jury had been locked in deliberation for hours, the weight of evidence and testimony hanging heavy in the air like a storm about to break. When the foreman finally stood, his voice cut through the tension with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "We find the defendant, Rick Donovan, guilty on all counts." The courtroom exploded into a chaotic symphony of raw emotion. Tears streamed down the faces of some, their sobs echoing off the wooden walls, while others leapt to their feet, cheering with a ferocity born of long-suppressed rage and relief. Amid the uproar, Jeremiah Carter stood still, his broad shoulders squared, his dark eyes steady. He watched as Rick Donovan, once a towering figure of unchecked authority, was escorted away in handcuffs. The former officer's face was ashen, stripped of the smug confidence that had defined him for so long. His head bowed under the weight of his own reckoning. For Jeremiah, the sight stirred a quiet satisfaction, not a vengeful glee, but a deep, resonant relief. This wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had suffered under the same abuse of power. It was about justice, a word too often spoken but rarely felt, finally taking root in this moment. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, where a restless crowd had gathered. Their voices rose in a chorus of triumph and defiance, a sea of placards and clenched fists demanding that this victory be more than fleeting. Jeremiah stepped forward, flanked by his steadfast colleague Maya and a group of civil rights leaders, whose presence lent gravitas to the scene. The podium creaked under his grip as he surveyed the faces before him, young and old, weary yet hopeful, each one a mirror reflecting the stakes of this battle. He took a breath, steadying the tremor of emotion in his chest, and spoke. "This isn't just my win," he said, his voice low but resonant, carrying over the murmur of the crowd. "This is for every voice that's been drowned out, every family that's clawed its way toward justice, every neighborhood that's refused to let corruption define it. We've got miles to go, but today we've shown that the tide can turn." The words hung in the air, met with a roar of approval that shook the ground beneath him. For Jeremiah, it was a bittersweet triumph. He felt the weight of every step that had led here, every scar visible and invisible that marked his journey. Word of Rick Donovan's conviction raced across the country like a wildfire tearing through dry brush. Newspapers splashed bold headlines across their front pages. "Racist cop found guilty, a watershed moment for accountability." Television screens flickered with footage of the trial, the grainy video of the shooting that had nearly ended Jeremiah's life, the trembling voices of witnesses who dared to speak, the mountain of evidence that had buried Donovan's lies. On social media, hashtags like Justice for Jeremiah and End Policy brutally pulsed with life, trending for days as people shared stories, outrage, and fragile glimmers of hope. The world couldn't look away, Yet, not everyone rejoiced. In dimly lit studios, pundits with furrowed brows spun counter-narratives, decrying Donovan as a martyr of cancel culture, or warning that his conviction would shackle police everywhere. Jeremiah, no stranger to such venom, watched these segments from his modest living room a week later. The flicker of the TV cast shadows across his face as he sat, still and pensive, his phone buzzing relentlessly beside him with messages of support and pleas for his voice. Across from him, Maya sorted through a towering stack of papyrus legal briefs, media requests, letters from strangers who saw him as a beacon. She glanced up, her sharp eyes catching the weariness in his posture. "You're a symbol now." "Jeremiah," she said, her tone firm yet warm, "this case seats lit a spark. People see you as proof that the system can bend when we push hard enough." He exhaled, a long, heavy breath that carried the exhaustion of years spent fighting. "It's a bitter pill, Maya. I never wanted to be a figurehead. I just wanted a world where men like Donovan don't get to play God with a badge." She leaned forward, her conviction cutting through his doubt. "You're doing more than that. This isn't just about one man's downfall, it's about tearing down the walls that protect dozens like him. Look at what's happening. Policies are shifting. States are rethinking immunity laws. You've ignited something bigger than you realize." Jeremiah nodded, but his gaze drifted to the window, where the city lights blurred into a distant haze. "Change is a slow beast," he murmured. "For every Donovan we nail, there's a line of others who slip through. This feels huge, but it's just the first crack in the dam." Maya reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "And that's why we don't stop. You've shown them what's possible. Now we keep the pressure on." In the days that followed, Jeremiah threw himself into the fray with a fervor that belied the ache still lingering in his body. From the shooting, he partnered with activists, his voice booming through megaphones at town halls, his presence steadying the trembling hands of those who spoke at protests. Community forums became his new battlefield, each one a chance to turn his survival into a rallying cry. The bullet that could have silenced him had instead forged him into a catalyst, a man whose quiet strength drew others to stand taller. Meanwhile, behind the gray walls of a prison cell, Rick Donovan's world crumbled. Stripped of his uniform and the swagger it once bestowed, he was no longer the predator who'd roamed streets with impunity. His days were marked by the clank of metal doors and the cold stares of guards, who made no effort to hide their contempt. Even among the inmates, he was a pariah, whispers of his crimes trailing him like a shadow. The man who'd once thrived on fear now shrank beneath its weight, his hatred a useless ember that couldn't warm the isolation consuming him. Back in the city, the echoes of the trial reverberated through the police department Donovan had once called home. The mayor, under a spotlight that refused to dim, ordered a sweeping review of every complaint filed against officers in the last decade. Dust-covered files were dragged into the light, revealing a legacy of abuse that had festered unchecked. High-ranking officials, their careers tethered to the old ways, tendered resignations with tight-lipped grimaces, while new regulations sprouted like weeds in the wake of scandal. The Carter case, as it was now dubbed, rippled beyond the precinct, stirring a cultural awakening. Schools rolled out bias training. Workplaces hosted halting conversations about systemic racism, topics once confined to hushed corners, now spilling into the open. It wasn't a perfect tide, but it was motion, a stuttering step toward something better. One evening, Jeremiah stood at the edge of a park, where hundreds had gathered under a sky streaked with dusk. Candles flickered in their hands, a constellation of light honoring those lost to violence, like the one that had nearly claimed him. A woman climbed onto the makeshift stage, her voice cracking as she recounted the night police took her. Sona wound years old, but still bleeding fresh. She spoke of Jeremiah's case as a fragile thread of hope, a sign that the scales might one day balance. Listening, Jeremiah felt his throat tighten, the grief of her words wrapping around his own scars. When his turn came, he approached the microphone, the crowd hushing into a reverent silence. "I didn't choose this road," he began, his voice steady but thick with feeling. "I didn't ask for that bullet, but I lived, and with that comes a debt I'll spend my life repaying. I won't rest until justice isn't just a dream we chase, cites the ground we stand on." The applause that followed was a thunderclap, the candlelight dancing like stars against the night. Stepping back, Jeremiah felt the weight of their trust settle into his bones, heavy yet galvanizing. He wasn't done in it by a long shot. A year slipped by, and the tremors of the Carter case hardened into tangible change. Laws shifted, mandating federal oversight for police misconduct, forcing body cameras into reluctant precincts, dragging repeat offenders into the light. Jeremiah's life had transformed too. His small law office, once a quiet refuge, now thrummed with purpose, its walls lined with files of those seeking his help, victims of the same systems he'd vowed to dismantle. One night, as the clock ticked past midnight, he pored over the case of a young black teacher wrongfully detained, her story a mirror to his own. Maya slipped in, setting a steaming mug of coffee before him. "You're burning out," she said, half teasing, half worried. He offered a tired smile. "Too much to do, Maya. Everyone shows me how much farther we've got to climb." She settled across from him, her gaze unwavering. "You can't fix it all tonight, Jeremiah. What you've built, what you're building, it's more than most dream of." He leaned back, the chair creaking under him. "It's not just me, it's the people who stood up, who shouted when I couldn't. Without them, Denovan's still out there. This isn't my victory, it's ours." Across town, Rick Denovan sat in his cell, the concrete walls closing in tighter with each passing day. The arrogance that had once armored him was gone, replaced by a bitter resignation that gnawed at his edges. Appeals had failed, the evidence a noose he couldn't slip. The uniform that had shielded him now mocked him, a relic of a life he'd squandered. He wasn't just imprisoned, Ed was erased, his name a cautionary tale whispered in precincts and bars. For the first time, he tasted the powerlessness he'd inflicted on others, and it was a sentence heavier than the bars around him. Meanwhile, the movement Jeremiah had sparked took root. A foundation bearing his name rose from the ashes of his ordeal, channeling funds to victims and fueling legal battles for reform. At its first event, he stood before a crowd of allies and survivors, their faces alight with purpose. "Tonight," he said, his voice ringing clear, "we honor the silenced, the fighters, the unbroken. This road is rough, and it's long, but together we've proven change isn't a myth, it's a choice. And we'll keep choosing it, for every soul who deserves justice." The room erupted, a swell of sound and spirit that lifted him. As he stepped down, hands reached out grateful, determined, and he met them with a quiet resolve. This was his fight, their fight, a testament to resilience that turned pain into power. The city pulsed beyond, alive with the promise of a battle not yet won, but fiercely begun. And Jeremiah knew, with every fiber of his being, that it was a fight worth wagging every single time.